My name is Jason De León. I am professor of anthropology and Chicano and Central American studies at University of California, Los Angeles, and I study migration between Latin America and the United States. Let's go to southern Mexico, Chiapas, about 80 kilometers north of the Guatemala border, to a dusty little village called Pacalna, which is a town of about a couple hundred people that is right on the migrant corridor between Guatemala heading up towards the Gulf Coast of Mexico. So picture a incredibly dense jungle, lots of insect and bird sounds. It's incredibly humid, and so you're just always sort of sweating, and you can never get enough water. And the story that I want to tell is about really my first day there. I was running an anthropological field school, and I brought some students with me, and it was kind of my last hurrah in terms of migration. I just finished my first book on migrant death along the U.S.-Mexico border, and I was thinking about actually walking away from migration studies. And my wife and I ended up running this anthropological field school in Chiapas, and it was kind of my goodbye to migration. I brought a bunch of students down, about 20 students, and I was going to have them interviewing migrants who were just starting to kind of experience a rise in Mexican immigration enforcement at the border. And we ended up working in a migrant shelter in Pacalna, run by a group of nuns. And at that point, I sort of bring my students into this migrant shelter, and I say, I want you guys just to be helpful for the first few weeks. We're not even going to do any interviews until people start to feel comfortable with you. And so we're in this shelter, and I wasn't thinking about a project at all. At this point, I was thinking about how can I help students sort of, do this work, and the shelter felt like a very safe place for them to kind of an entry into ethnographic work. But then one of the things that happened was these nuns said to me, whatever you do, don't go outside. There's lots of bad people outside. And so, of course, the first thing I did was go right outside to see what this was all about. And so I walk out to the train tracks right next to this migrant shelter, and I start kind of walking around, and I hear it first. I just hear a bunch of reggaeton playing, and I hear, these guys kind of laughing, sort of cackling. I can smell there's this huge cloud of marijuana smoke. And so it was just kind of a bunch of rough looking guys hanging out, listening to music. And I walk up to them, and I just kind of introduce myself. And they were like, well, who the hell are you? What are you doing here? And I tried to explain, said, oh, I'm an anthropologist. And they sort of don't really know what that is. And so I said, well, it's kind of like sort of like a journalist, but I'm probably more annoying because I'm here longer and I keep asking the same questions over and over again. And they said, well, what do you do? I said, well, I just wrote this book about migrants in the desert. And one of these kids looks at me and he says, well, why don't you interview us? And I was like, well, why would I want to interview you guys? And they said, well, we're smugglers, we're coyotes. And this kid said to me, he goes, people think that we're the bad guys, but it's not really that simple. And no one ever listens to our stories. Why don't you listen to our stories? And so I just said, oh, okay, sure. I mean, it was a 5-minute introduction. They said, basically, are you a cop? I said, no, I'm not a cop. And I said, okay. And they said, well, you go buy us some beer? I was like, sure, I'll buy you some beer. Let's hang out. And so I just start sitting with these guys and talking, and this story just starts to unfold. And it was really in that moment that I realized that these folks really had an interesting story to tell, that you can't talk about undocumented migration without talking about smugglers. And yet I had never really had an opportunity to talk to these folks in any real meaningful way. And so I meet this kid, Roberto, and he says, why don't you listen to me? And so I start talking to this kid, and it became very clear that he had a lot of interesting things to say. It was really fascinating. And I was sort of very moved by his story. And I really wasn't anticipating doing a project on smugglers. I was like, well, I'll interview him, and maybe I'll write kind of a short piece, and then I'm gonna walk away from this and move on to a different type of project. And I got to know this kid really well over the course of several months. And then when I left the field, about a week after I left the field, he was murdered. And it was his death that sort of brought me back to Mexico to think about smugglers, to think about who he was, what his life had been like, and how he had ended up in that situation. But I really, in the beginning, I think those two moments, like one being introduced to these smugglers and then really wanting to talk about stuff, kind of got me interested in the subject. And then it was his unfortunate death that really kind of forced me then to try to understand that. But I think what I didn't understand at the time was that all of these young men, very troubled young men, felt I was sort of drawn to them. I think there was this kind of kinship that I had with them, and they reminded me of a lot of people I grew up with, and they reminded me oftentimes of myself. I didn't quite understand that until later on, when the book was almost done, that I was really trying to understand myself, my sort of troubled past, through the way in which that they were kind of living it in real time. But it was this thing, they were these kind of rough kids with interesting stories. They were difficult stories that they were telling me, but it wasn't, but it felt strangely familiar. And so I just felt like, well, I think I could write about these guys in a way that felt really honest and sincere. And, it wasn't going to be like, my understanding of smuggling was not very well developed, and so as they started to kind of teach me about it, it just became clear that there was a lot happening. There was a lot of layers to it, and yeah, I really was just deeply moved by their stories. And a lot of these guys coming from very difficult circumstances, and nobody wants to be a smuggler. They're all kind of forced into it in different ways, and then they spend much of their lives then trying to get away from it. It taught me that there was a lot there, and I just had to be open to listening. And nothing is black and white. And unfortunately, with the conversations about smugglers, it often is like smugglers are bad, migrants are good. And these guys, who are all migrants themselves, really complicated that narrative in a lot of important ways.